Hannah over at Hannah's Books did a reading of another Eudora Welty story, Why I Live at the P.O., which was just brilliant, and you should all go watch Hannah read that story, because it is another great Eudora Welty story, which does many of the things which I discussed here, even though it does more of it through dialogue, and Hannah does a really great reading, so please go over and check that out. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome back to my short story project. This year I set out to read and discuss one short story a month from kind of American classic writers. This month's story was A Worn Path by Eudora Welty, and I have to be honest with you, I have probably thought more about what to say in this video and how to describe this story than I have about any of the other stories we've read, and I think I've also found this story to be the most delightful of any of the stories that I read so far. Not that it's an easy story, not that it's a funny story, it just is an example, I think, of a writer at the height of her powers, I think, in writing an incredibly simple but incredibly deep and involved story. So A Worn Path is the story of Phoenix Jackson. She is a very old African-American woman, and she is on a journey. She is walking from her home into town. Now, at the beginning of the story, we don't know what she's going there for, but essentially, Phoenix Jackson lives way off in the woods outside of Natchez, Mississippi, with her grandson in what have to be considered probably really impoverished circumstances, as we'll see when I read the description of Phoenix Jackson. And along the way, she has adventures, misadventures. She encounters people, things, places, memories, and it becomes clear to us that Phoenix has taken this long journey by foot many times, as the name A Worn Path indicates. So I just thought I would start off by reading a description of Phoenix and what's going on at the beginning of the story. So this is probably the first two paragraphs of the story that I'm going to read. It was December, a bright frozen day in the early morning. Far out in the country there was an old Negro woman with her head tied in a red rag coming along a path through the pine woods. Her name was Phoenix Jackson. She was very old and small, and she walked slowly in the dark pine shadows, moving a little from side to side in her steps with the balanced heaviness and lightness of a pendulum in a grandfather clock. She carried a thin, small cane made from an umbrella, and with this she kept tapping the frozen earth in front of her. This made a grave and persistent noise in the still air that seemed meditative, like the chirping of a solitary little bird. She wore a dark striped dress reaching down to her shoe tops and an equally long apron of bleached sugar sacks with a full pocket, all neat and tidy, but every time she took a step she might have fallen over her shoelaces, which dragged from her unlaced shoes. She looked straight ahead. Her eyes were blue with age. Her skin had a pattern all its own of numberless branching wrinkles, and as though a whole little tree stood in the middle of her forehead, but a golden color ran underneath, and the two knobs of her cheeks were illumined by a yellow burning under the dark. Under the red rag her hair came down on her neck in the frailest of ringlets, still black, and with an odor like copper. So we learned so much about Phoenix Jackson from that first reading. We learned about her age. We learned about her dress, which will be important to her in the story. We learn about her poverty. Her cane is made from an umbrella, and her apron is made from bleached flour sacks. You know, things that she could have repurposed. We learn about her race, and notice the use of the term Negro here is a part of the time period in which the story was written, which I think it was written around 1940 or 1941. Certainly that wouldn't be an appropriate term to use today. But also notice, I think, the care and the compassion with which Welty describes Phoenix. Notice her name is Phoenix, and she does rise up several times to continue on her journey during the course of this story. So at first, I think Phoenix just seems like an old lady on a walk. She's on a quest. She's headed somewhere. She describes her journey in stages. It's obviously a journey she's taken before, up through the pines, down through the oaks. She says at one point she crosses cotton fields, she crosses a cornfield, she makes her way across a creek on a log. She knows where to stop to drink, to get a good cool drink of water. She definitely knows the way. She remembers other times and past and other seasons and problems that may have beset her, from a two-headed snake to bulls wandering in a field that she has to cross. But no matter what the circumstances, cold, hot, animals around her, the difficulty of a woman of her age walking across, a log over a creek, she goes, and she is determined to go on her way. There are several things I think about this journey that are interesting to me in thinking about what the story is about and what the rest of the story is about. Because on the surface, Phoenix is going to town to get something. She's left her grandson behind in their cabin, and she's going to town to get something. But there are other things at work here too, and things I think are really interesting about Phoenix. We learn that she is particular and worried about her dress, that she feels like she has to look just the right way. She gets caught in a thorn bush, and she has difficulty extricating herself from that thorn bush. But she does, and she worries about tearing her dress. She has to really carefully cross a barbed wire fence so as not to get stuck, but also she worries about tearing her dress. She is very conscious of looking a certain way and of presenting the best picture of herself that she can. When she gets to town, she asks a woman to tie her shoelaces because, while it's okay in the country, it's not okay there in the paved part of the city and in the buildings that she has to go to. She's also crafty, and she's also resourceful, and you can also get the sense of her as a survivalist. There are two occasions in which money comes up. In one occasion, when she meets a white hunter in the woods on her journey, he drops a nickel, and she becomes fixated on this nickel, as probably only somebody who really needs a nickel can. And she devises a way to kind of cleverly trick the guy to going off so she can have time to bend down and pick up the nickel. When she gets to town and she's in the office that was her destination, she also is able to acquire another nickel, and she's going to spend those nickels on her grandson. We learn that she wanted an education. She sees a diploma on the wall at the office that she goes to, and she thinks about how that was a dream that she had. And then we learn that she didn't get an education because, as she says, when the surrender came, she was too old to go to school. The only surrender I can think of that possibly would be the Confederate surrender in 1865, meaning that Phoenix has been enslaved and lived through this period of enslavement, and she's survived that. And I think her survival is an incredibly important part of the story, and as well as what she's surviving for, and what she's surviving for, and why she's on the journey is kind of the point of the story, or kind of the plot point of the story. And I will try not to spoil that. There are other things that I think are really interesting, and this will be kind of, I think, where I leave the story. And those are things I think about the way in which Welty is describing almost Phoenix's journey from the past to the present, and in a way describing the journey of African American people from the past into what would have been Eudora Welty's present, and a present, I think, in which she may have been overly optimistic about the future and the way in which treatment would take place. You should know that the white people that Phoenix encounters are condescending. They call her granny, they call her grandma, they call her aunt. They may be willing to help her, and sometimes they do, but they're not necessarily filled with compassion. Knowing what they know about her, none of them offers her a ride home. None of them, really offers her a tremendous amount of help, even though there is some there, and I don't want to go too far with that. But one of the things I found interesting in rereading the story was these little glimpses of, or what I take as little hints of the violence that took place around racism after the Civil War came to an end. And so I just wanted to read you a couple of passages which I thought were kind of ominous and kind of invoked this past of the South in terms of race relations. And so the first is just a really short passage. It's a description of part of the place where Phoenix has to walk. At last she was safe through the fence and risen up out in the clearing. Big dead trees, like black men with one arm, were standing in the purple stalks of the withered cotton field. There sat a buzzard. "Who you watching?" That was Phoenix at the end. So this sentence, big dead trees like black men with one arm, were standing in the purple stalks of the withered cotton field. So obviously the cotton field, when we're talking about a story in the South, recalls ideas of enslaved African Americans working in the fields. These trees being described like black men with one arm, maybe a recollection or a hint or an allusion to lynchings, maybe an allusion to the fact that enslaved African American men were mutilated, were harmed, were left unwhole by slavery. I thought that was pretty ominous there. When she meets the white hunter in the woods, and she's able to kind of trick him so she can pick the nickel up that he dropped on the ground. When he comes back, they have another encounter and another conversation. Then the man came back, and his own dog panted about them. "Well, I scared him off that time," he said, and then he laughed and he lifted his gun and pointed it at Phoenix. She stood straight and faced him. "Doesn't the gun scare you?" he said, pointing it. "No, sir. I've seen plenty go off closer by in my day, and for far less than what I done," she said, holding utterly still. So she faces down a gun, and when he says, he is trying to scare this old African American woman out in the woods, when he says, aren't you afraid of the gun? She says, "No, I've been close to guns that have gone off, and for far less reason than I had." So she's been around white men with guns who fired those guns for a reason less than stealing a nickel. And so we have to assume that she has seen racist violence against or up close, and that's a part of her history, which I find to kind of make the story a lot more poignant and powerful, these kind of allusions. By the way, when Phoenix walks from her home to the city, she is literally traveling from, as I said, from the past to the more modern world. She goes through, obviously old plantation fields where the withered cotton fields are, and cornfields where there's an old scarecrow who at first she thinks is a ghost. And when she figures out it's a scarecrow, she actually does like a little dance with the scarecrow, which I found to be kind of interesting. She walks past boarded up cabins and she says, "I'm walking in their sleep," referring to these cabins. And those cabins, those shacks, to me I thought, well, maybe those are old slave cabins and old slave shacks that have been left behind on the plantation. As she gets closer to Natchez, she walks through the unpaved streets on the outskirts of town in the African American neighborhood, where she's surrounded by African American children, and then on to what she calls the paved streets, or the paved part of the city, which I would think is kind of an indication of maybe the part of the city dominated by white people. It is an incredibly good story. It is incredibly well told. It is one of those stories where you feel like every word was carefully placed and thought about for its impact and its ability to convey meaning and to create characterization. So would love to hear what you think about the story. If you picked up on any things that I picked up on, or if you picked up on way more than I did. I always feel like I miss things in these story discussions, and I enjoy hearing your thoughts in the comment section. So please leave me a comment. Anyway, thanks for watching.